This episode is brought to you with support from PerfectDailyGrind.com. Perfect Daily Grind, your source for coffee education, articles, videos, and more, from the farm to the cup.
Support comes from SF Bay Coffee, who pays farmers sustainable prices and helps build homes, schools, and medical facilities for their communities. Learn more at their website and get 10% off with the code COFFEEPODCAST at sfbaycoffee.com. We took a deep dive into the history of coffee price in the last two episodes. Today we take a sort of sidestep to investigate something we may not have originally thought was so related to the conversation. That is, coffee disease, specifically coffee leaf rust. What does this coffee plant disease have to do with the coffee price crisis? Stuart McCook, author of the new book Coffee is Not Forever and professor of history, joins us on these two episodes to talk about just that. You told me you're a historian who specializes in the environmental history of coffee farming. That's wildly specific. So I'm curious, how did you end up in this specialty as a historian?
It's funny because it doesn't necessarily feel wildly specific. The world of coffee is pretty big, but it's not an obvious career path. So I guess I started off in another seemingly wildly specific area in history of science. And for a variety of reasons, I wound up writing my PhD thesis on the history of the agricultural and botanical sciences in tropical Latin America in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And it was when I was working on that stuff that I started not only to look at the scientists and the institutions, but to actually look at what the scientists were seeing. Like, why does all this science start to happen at a particular moment in time? And one of the reasons is that farmers in Latin America were starting to experience a number of very significant problems in production: soil erosion, soil exhaustion. And the one that really grabbed my attention was diseases and pests. So sugarcane was getting hit by diseases, rubber was getting hit by diseases, cocoa, and coffee. And I was really curious as to why all of these crops, which botanically are quite different, are being struck by these diseases, which are also, from the terms of, they're viruses, they're fungi, they're all sorts of different pathogens. But what they all have in common, of course, is that they're global commodities. And so from there, I decided that after I finished my dissertation, I was going to focus on one of these diseases, and it wound up being coffee. Specifically
rust, I suppose.
Specifically the coffee rust, because that's kind of, in the world of coffee diseases, it's the iconic one. And it's really global. So one of the things that really interested me as a historian are the global connections of coffee. When we think about coffee commodity chains, we often think about plantation to cup, right? From producer to consumer. But there are other connections. There are connections between the different coffee growing parts of the world. Human connections, movement of plants, and as it turns out, movement of diseases. When, for example, in 1800, say, and if you were a coffee farmer in Guatemala, you probably wouldn't have been a coffee farmer in Guatemala in 1800. There weren't that many of them. But even as late as, say, 1830 or 1840, if you were farming coffee in Guatemala and there was a disease outbreak somewhere in the Indian Ocean basin, a coffee disease outbreak, you wouldn't have needed to be that worried. By the early 20th century, you needed to be really worried because diseases were moving a lot faster.
Because of those connections you just mentioned.
Because of these connections.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
You think about, part of it, of course, is people and technology. This is one of the great ages, and you can use the term great in scare quotes, of European empire and expansion, particularly in the Eastern Hemisphere, but also technological innovations, particularly the steamship and railroads, which are connecting not just people, but you can think about it as connecting ecosystems in ways that they had never really been connected before.
You start your book and you're talking about seeing this Arabica graveyard, and that really stuck out to me. It painted I'm a poetic kind of guy, and that just painted this horrifying image for me. Can you sort of explain that experience to us?
Well, this is a moment where I felt in that moment was a profound connection with a historical source, but I'll describe what happened first. So I was with some friends in a small town in Cundinamarca province in Colombia called Sasaima, doing a history workshop. But we went out for a hike as in one of the breaks in the workshop, and as it transpired, it took us through a coffee zone that had been affected by the rust. And if you've ever been to central Colombia, it's just stunningly beautiful, these lush mountain landscapes. And that was my initial impression. It was just, the snow-capped mountains and the Cordillera across the way, and then coffee plants and coffee farms. And as I was walking through, though, I noticed that there were patches of what initially seemed to me to be just scrub. But as we approached them along the trail, I realized that this wasn't scrub, or not just scrub. What this was essentially an Arabica graveyard. There were Arabica trees, or I was going to say what had been Arabica trees. They were still Arabica trees, but it was just basically the central stalk and branches. The trees had been almost completely defoliated, and there was, blackened, shriveled fruit hanging from them, and then grass and other plants had grown up around them. And what these very clearly were abandoned plots of coffee, where farmers had clearly just decided that they were going to walk away from their farms and let it go wild again. And in that moment, I had almost this moment of communion with a long-dead author named Elizabeth Skidmore, who traveled to Java in the late 19th century and visited Java just after the coffee leaf rust epidemic had afflicted Java. And she described, I think, on an experience very similar to mine on a much larger scale of rows of Arabica trees standing like skeletons.
Wow, that imagery. Yeah.
And it's almost this like zombie imagery. And I think I would like to stress, though, but both she and I were seeing the trees weren't necessarily dead, but they were at the same time almost like you could think of them almost like zombies, to push the metaphor a little bit further, in the sense that they were alive but not really functioning the way, coffee as a crop normally would.
The conversation of leaf rust sounds important, but in your opinion, maybe why do you think it's so important to the conversation today, especially surrounding the current coffee price crisis?
I think it matters both. The coffee rust matters both in itself as a very important disease that has a huge impact on people's lives and livelihoods, but also because it is an indicator of relationships between economic processes and environmental processes. That is, I think at times diseases like this look just kind of like random accidents, right? Much the same way a hurricane or a tornado is a random accident. But in fact, often the trigger itself might be more or less random. But the impact of the disease reflects long-standing or fairly long-standing social and economic processes. Also, I think the other thing why the coffee rust is so important to talk about is also, I think it's a good way of starting to think about climate change. If you think about how communities, if you think about coffee rust, you can think about it as a way that a coffee farming community has related to a sudden change in the coffee ecosystem.
Yeah.
And compared to climate change, a fairly small one. But still, the response to coffee rust gives you a sense of the kind of responses that are going to be necessary for climate change more generally.
I always want to be careful to assume what our listeners know or don't know. So let's start super basic here. What is coffee leaf rust?
I've been there myself, and I've benefited actually from some scientists very patiently walking me through this. So at its most simple, the coffee leaf rust is a fungus. And the fungus begins its life as a spore. So you can think of it almost like a tiny grain of flour, like baking flour, right? The spore will land on a coffee leaf, and in the presence of liquid water, so dew or rainfall, it will germinate. And in germinating, it sends little tendrils almost into the leaf tissue, and it starts to colonize and feed on the leaf tissue. One British botanist earlier in the 20th century described these fungi as the vampires of the vegetable world.
Wow. The imagery again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a lovely image. And so what happens then is the fungus will colonize the leaf tissue and create an orange-colored spot from which the rust gets its name. If a leaf has many of these spots, it ceases to function properly because the leaves are essential in photosynthesis, and the photosynthesis is what provides a lot of nutrients to the trees. And in a really severe outbreak, the tree can be partially or even wholly defoliated. And essentially what happens then is the tree is starved, at least for that season, of nutrients. And then there are sort of two different kinds of consequences. The short-term losses, which are called primary losses, are the losses of that year's harvest, since the tree is starved of nutrients, and so the fruit either doesn't develop at all or doesn't develop properly. And I've tasted coffee harvested from rust infested trees, and some of it tastes very papery, is something that you often hear used to describe beans from that. But almost the more severe impact is what are called the secondary losses. So what happens is, without the leaves, often the growth of the branches and the plant tissue necessary to bear the next harvest, that those branches don't develop properly, and so there's often a large impact in the year following the outbreak.
Okay, wow.
And then once the rust itself completes its life cycle, it bursts basically back out of the bottom of the leaf and redistributes a new set of spores. And a single pustule can send out hundreds of thousands of spores, which work their way through the ecosystem, carried by wind, carried by animals, carried by people.
Yeah.
Right? You imagine you're a coffee picker walking through,
Wow.
walking through the farm, the leaf brushes up against your clothes, or you're just walking through the farm and stuff lands on your clothes, and then you walk to the next farm to pick coffee, and it moves that way.
Amazing.
And it's really almost impossible to stop.
Wow.
Since we're going for vivid metaphors, one agronomist once described this to me as the coffee rust to me is kind of like peeing in a pool. That is, once it's in there, it's very difficult to get it out.
Wow.
We often talk about diseases just in terms of the pathogen. In fact, the way I just did. When you asked me what coffee leaf rust is, I said, well, it's a fungus. But in fact, it's more helpful to think about disease not only as a pathogen, but also as a system. And the system includes a couple of different things. At its most simple, the disease involves the pathogen itself. But then if you think about it, you also need to have a susceptible host. That is, you need an organism to get sick. And one of the important things here one of the things that would be important later on in the history of coffee is that some varieties and species of coffee are less susceptible to the rust than others. So we've got the pathogen, we've got the host, and then the third critical part is the environment. And both in the narrow level of whatever the cropping practices are on the individual farm, whether the farmer practices polyculture, monoculture, uses shade, doesn't use shade, and then also the broader environmental kind of landscape questions. How high are you? How much rainfall do you have? How much sunshine do you have? And really what you get when you get an epidemic is a complex interaction between the pathogen, the host, and the environment. And it's really those things together that produce the epidemic, not just the pathogen alone.
I guess my question is, has this disease always been around, or can we pinpoint a place and a date and time where it all began?
The answer to those questions is yes. So
Yeah.
at one level, the disease has been around, as far as we know, for as long as coffee has been around. And I'm speaking here not just of Arabica coffee, but the coffee genus, which is kind of spread across equatorial Africa. Spread across tropical Africa. So, and I think one of the important things to keep in mind about the rust is it's not just a parasite of Arabica coffee, but of many of the species of the genus. And as far as we know, it co-evolved with one or more species of coffee. The early history is really, really poorly understood, I would say. Okay. So in that sense, it's always been around. But there was this kind of weird thing that happened with the global coffee industry that I talk about a lot in my book, which is, as many of your listeners probably know, Arabica coffee is pretty much originally from southwestern Ethiopia. So it's got a very tiny center of origin. But the first place it was really cultivated commercially on a large scale was across the Red Sea in Yemen. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's known as Arabica coffee, not, Ethiopica or right. Something like that. Mm-hmm. And then almost all of the world's cultivated coffee in the 18th and 19th century circulated from Yemen and not from Ethiopia. And Yemen, weirdly enough, is one of the few environments where the Arabica coffee can be made to grow, but where the rust does not flourish.
Oh, so because the climate?
The climate is just inimical to the rust. There was this agronomist named Pierre Sylvain who worked in the 50s who kind of studied both sides of the Red Sea and was, expressed a measure of surprise that on the Ethiopian side, the plants were often riddled with rust, whereas on the Yemen side, they were largely or almost completely free of the rust. So wow. Okay. Coffee was then taken, through to India, Ceylon, Java, and then in the 1720s into the Americas. And it was essentially clean because of the filter of Yemen. But then in 1869, a farmer in the center of Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, but what was then a British colony that produced coffee, noticed this weird spot on his leaves. And that's when kind of the modern history of the coffee rust happens. Wow. Or is recorded. So we can pinpoint very clearly when it first became a problem for commercial coffee.
I see. And I've heard you use the word epidemic and then in the book, talking about the pandemic of the big rust. So you gave us some of the genesis history. Some of you said some things aren't fully understood, but the things that are understood, you kind of sounds like you finished off on that note. So when did we really first, in the global history of coffee, notice, say, something like an epidemic?
1869, when a farmer in a small corner of Ceylon noticed some spots on his leaves and took it to one of the local scientists at the botanical garden in Ceylon, who didn't recognize it, and so he sent it off to an eminent scholar in the UK, somebody who had actually worked on the fungus that caused the Irish potato famine 20 or 30 years before that.
Wow, okay.
And he identified this as a completely previously unknown species of fungus. And it had been identified botanically, but the big question then was, what do you do about it? And between about 1869 and 1880, the disease continued to spread through Ceylon, and nobody really knew what to do about it. At the time in Ceylon, through the 1870s, global coffee prices were really high. Mm-hmm. So, in fact, even though the disease was causing a lot of losses, in many cases, farmers' incomes were going up in spite of the disease. And this kind of interplay between economy, disease, and environment is really, really important. So it was worth their while, at least over the short term, they could coexist with the disease economically, even at moments when it caused fairly significant losses. Then in the early 1880s, the disease continued to spread. I think the load got a lot harder. And then global coffee prices started to fall fairly rapidly as Brazilian production started to expand. So this is, again, farmers halfway around the world being affected by changes in the global coffee economy.
It's amazing.
Coffee prices start to fall, and at this point, faced with sort of the twin pressures of declining production because of the disease and declining coffee prices, they couldn't make a go of it. At the same time, the botanists over at the experiment station were trying to experiment with introducing alternate crops. And they experimented first with cinchona, which is a bark used for making medicines that control malaria, which was really important in the 19th century. But then later they really hit the jackpot with tea. And so the British planters, and there were local planters as well, but the British planters in particular were almost en masse in the space of 5 or 6 years said, right, basically we can't keep cultivating coffee under the twin pressures of catastrophically declining prices and the rust. So they just basically collectively switched to tea.
Wow.
The kind of simple story is that the coffee rust caused the collapse of Ceylon's coffee industry. Although, as I'm sketching out here, the take-home message is slightly more complicated than that. It is the combination of the rust and low coffee prices, and also the ability of the state or some public organization to provide them with a viable alternative to coffee that really kind of collectively fueled this massive shift. As an aside, I just want to loop back to one of your earlier series of podcasts about myths about coffee, if I could.
Oh, totally.
One of the common stories you will see about the rust is that this explains why the British drink tea instead of coffee. And it's a really beautiful story. When I got into this project, I told it often myself because it just sounded so great, and it really sounded like a good object lesson on the impacts of diseases like this. Unfortunately for me, I started actually looking at the evidence to support this claim, and it turns out there isn't any. I looked at British consumption statistics for the 19th century, and there's no bump at all when the rust devastates Ceylon. If the British had switched from drinking coffee to tea in 5 years, surely there would have also been a huge documentary outcry. There isn't. There's just, the needle didn't move at all in terms of British consumption. And then you have to think then about what the larger lesson of this is for the broader history of rust. Yeah. Which is, to the extent that the collapse of Ceylon's coffee industry had an impact, they were able to easily source coffee from other parts of the world.
Yes, that makes sense why the needle didn't move.
Exactly. And so from a consumer's perspective, problems like the rust are rarely a problem for consumers. Because consumers can get their coffee from other origins. And this has been true of the coffee rust ever since, which is why we know, on those of us who live in the world of the consumers mostly, don't hear about it that much, even though it's huge for the people who produce it. And it's just in part the nature of the global coffee industry that creates this huge disjuncture. A few years ago, I gave an interview on a TV station here in Canada, and they asked, what's the impact of the rust on Canada? And, the short answer is not much. The longer answer is a little more nuanced. I mean, in later epidemics, it helped trigger migration and things like that.
Professor McCook isn't finished with the story. Catch the next episode for some more history and potential solutions to the problems we face as coffee people in the shadow of this crisis. You can find a 30% discount code with free non-international shipping for the paperback edition of Stuart's new book, Coffee is Not Forever, on our website at thecoffeepodcast.org or in our newsletter. To clarify, that's a 30% discount code for anyone who buys the book, free shipping for non-internationals only, and sign up for our newsletter through our website or through our Instagram bio. If you want to reach out, contact me at info@thecoffeepodcast.org. I want to go ahead and give a shout out to our listeners out in Bangladesh. Thanks for listening. Music is by Michael Parallax. I'm Jesse Hartman. Thanks for tuning in, and as always, and until next time, happy brewing.